Can we really understand the mind just by observing it like a science experiment? Or do we have to consider what it feels like from the inside, that subjective experience? That's a question Wilhelm Wundt, the father of experimental psychology, was wrestling with over 100 years ago. And it's a question that feels incredibly relevant even today, especially with all the focus on neuroscience these days.
Absolutely.
We've got these fascinating excerpts from a research paper by Saulo de Araujo, and it's all about the philosophy behind Wundt's approach to psychology. And I'm kind of really excited to dig into this.
It's interesting, because it's a side of Wundt that a lot of people don't really get to see. People hear Wundt and they think experiments, that famous lab in Leipzig. But his work goes so much deeper. So much of it is rooted in these big philosophical questions.
And Araújo makes a really good point about this. He says there really aren't that many good overviews of Wundt's philosophy, especially not in English.
Right.
So most of us are getting this very, simplified, almost cartoon version of this incredibly important figure. And to really get Wundt, to get how he approached psychology, Araújo argues you have to understand those philosophical roots, which is what makes this deep dive so exciting. We're going beyond the usual textbook summaries and getting into the real meat of Wundt's ideas.
And there's a lot more there than people realize, way more than just those famous experiments.
Which is a good thing, because let's be honest, reading Wundt, well, it's not exactly what you call light reading, is it?
No, not exactly. It's dense, even in the original German.
Elaborate is a good word for it.
Oh, absolutely. Those sentences just keep going.
Araújo describes them as, and I quote here, intercalated with various subordinate clauses.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
I don't know about you, but that makes me picture like one of those Russian nesting dolls. Sentences within sentences within sentences.
Yeah, that's a pretty accurate visual. But that's where we come in, right? Consider us your Wundt translators. We're going to unpack these ideas and hopefully make them a little less intimidating, a little more fun to think about.
Exactly. So to kick things off, let's set the stage. When Wundt was dreaming up this whole new field of psychology, what was he actually trying to achieve? What was his big vision?
Well, he was really trying to create something totally new and distinct, something that wasn't just philosophy and wasn't just physiology. He defined psychology as the study of what he called immediate experience. And he saw that as very different from the way, say, the natural sciences explored the world.
Okay, immediate experience. I mean, on the surface, that sounds simple enough, but I have a feeling there's more to it. Can you break that down for us a bit, for me and for our listeners? What exactly did Wundt mean by this term, this immediate experience?
Sure. So he actually talked about two ways of approaching experience. He said that the natural sciences, with their instruments and measurements, they deal with what he called immediate experience. They study the external world, but they're always abstracting away from immediate sensations, trying to find those objective truths about how things work.
So like a physicist using a thermometer to measure temperature. They're not just going by how hot or cold they feel. They're looking for that objective measurement.
Exactly. A perfect example. Psychology, on the other hand, that was all about immediate experience, the actual feeling of hot or cold, that raw sensory data as we perceive it in a given moment. It's about understanding the world from inside our own minds. All those internal subjective experiences we're all having constantly.
And this is where that idea of introspection comes in, right?
Yeah.
Looking inward, observing your own thoughts and feelings as they're happening.
Precisely. Wundt thought introspection was absolutely crucial for studying immediate experience. He believed that if you could train people to observe their own mental processes, to really pay attention, and you did this under controlled conditions.
And now I'm picturing his lab, all those meticulously designed experiments he was famous for. That was all geared towards understanding immediate experience, wasn't it?
It was. He was trying to take this subjective human experience, and study it scientifically. But even with all that control, Wundt knew introspection wasn't perfect. He knew it could never be completely objective. We can never really step outside of our own minds, can we?
So he was walking this really fascinating line. On the one hand, you have the rigorous experimental methods, this drive to bring objectivity to the study of the mind. But at the same time, he's admitting that complete objectivity might just be impossible when you're dealing with something as inherently subjective as human experience.
Exactly. And it's what makes his work so interesting, so relevant even now. He was grappling with these really big fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness, about what it even means to observe something, and about how the mind and the world interact. He knew he was only just scratching the surface.
And speaking of scratching the surface, this deep dive is already showing us a side of Wundt I bet most people haven't encountered. Because on top of this whole introspection thing, he was also really interested in something he called Volcker psychology, which roughly translates to
Folk psychology. It's the study of the collective mind, how our cultures shape how we think and act.
wow, folk psychology.
That was a really, really crucial part of his work. Yeah, it doesn't get as much attention as the lab work, but it was super important to Wundt. See, he saw individual consciousness as like one half of the equation. He didn't think you could really understand the mind without looking at those cultural forces that shape us, those things that individual introspection just couldn't uncover.
So instead of just asking someone, hey, what are you thinking? You look at the stories they tell, their rituals, the art they create, almost like you're piecing together this cultural puzzle, right? To understand the shared psychology underneath. That's such a cool idea. What was Wundt hoping to discover by going about it this way?
So he believed that these cultural products, these expressions of a shared mindset, they could give us a whole new window into higher order mental processes. Things like language, myth, religion, social customs, these were things that, in his view, you just couldn't really understand through individual introspection alone. In fact, he even said that Volcker psychology was essential for really wrapping our heads around how complex human thought develops in the first place.
So an individual mind, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's being molded all the time by these larger cultural forces. It's like our own individual consciousness. It's just one instrument in this giant cultural orchestra.
I like that. That's a great way to think about it. And it's crazy how relevant that idea still is today. Think about the impact of social media, how ideas spread through the internet like wildfire. We're more interconnected now than ever before.
Right.
Our collective minds are constantly bumping up against each other, influencing each other.
It's almost like Wundt anticipated the internet, social media, way back then. But okay, so we've got introspection, looking at individual experience, and we've got Volcker psychology exploring the collective consciousness. I have to say, this is already way more complex than what you usually get in those textbook descriptions of Wundt. But we're not quite done yet, are we? We've still got these two big principles that Araújo says are like the foundation of Wundt's whole system. And he calls them psychophysical parallelism and psychic causality, which I have to admit, those sound a little intimidating.
They're big ideas for sure, but they're not as complicated as they sound. Let's start with psychophysical parallelism. Basically, what this principle boils down to is Wundt's belief that mental processes and physical processes in the body, they happen at the same time, in parallel, but one doesn't directly cause the other.
So like two sides of the same coin, they're always together, but they're still distinct.
Yeah, exactly. A perfect analogy, like imagine you're feeling happy. There's a certain pattern of neural activity happening in your brain, but one doesn't cause the other. It's not like the neural activity makes you happy or the other way around. They're connected, intertwined, they happen together, but as two aspects of the same experience.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes sense.
Oh.
But how did that influence how he actually studied the mind? I mean, if these mental and physical processes were like two sides of the same coin, how did that actually play out in his scientific approach?
Yeah. Well, it shaped his whole methodology. He believed that by studying mental processes, things like, introspection and Volcker psychology, that's how we could figure out those internal subjective laws that govern our minds. Even if we couldn't directly see or measure those physical processes in the brain, it was about understanding the inner workings of experience itself.
It's like mapping this whole universe of the mind, even if we can't actually travel to all those planets and stars yet.
Right, exactly. That's a great way to put it. He was trying to create a true science of experience, a way to understand these subjective realms that, to him, were just as real, just as powerful as the physical world. So, ready to tackle psychic causality.
Hit me with it. Let's see what kind of mental puzzle one throws at us now.
Okay, so this one emphasizes the idea that mental events, your thoughts, your feelings, they're caused by the mental events that came before them. So it's this idea that how you're feeling and thinking right now that's shaped by everything you've experienced in the past, and this kind of internal flow of consciousness that we all have going on.
So this is where Wundt really gets into the nitty-gritty, the actual mechanics of how our minds work. Like how all of our experiences get woven together over time to make us who we are, how we approach the world, even how we react in any given moment.
You got it. He believed that if you really wanted to understand the mind, you had to go deeper than just the immediate stimulus and response, what just happened and how you reacted. He wanted nothing less than to map out all those intricate hidden connections between mental events, because those are what he thought gave rise to all of it. Our thoughts, our feelings, our actions, everything.
So with psychic causality, it's like one saying, look, our minds aren't just these blank slates, just reacting to whatever's happening around us.
Right.
They're shaped by this whole internal logic, these unique pathways. Our thoughts and feelings have carved out over time. It's like there's this whole chain reaction of mental events happening under the surface of everything. And it's by understanding those connections, those cause and effect relationships, that's how we can really start to make sense of consciousness itself, what it actually is.
Exactly. And it's a perspective you just don't see as much these days. Don't you think? Like, we're so focused on the brain now, mapping all those neural networks.
Right.
But Wundt, he reminds us that the mind, it's more than just neurons firing,
It's more than the sum of its parts.
Yes. There's this whole other level, the subjective experience that you just can't reduce to brain chemistry, no matter how hard you try.
It's like we're so busy looking at the hardware that we've forgotten about the software.
Yeah.
But that software, those individual experiences, the memories, the emotions, that's what determines how we interact with the world, how we actually experience reality,
Exactly. It shapes everything. Which brings us back to Wundt's whole thing about psychology. It can't lose touch with philosophy. If we want to understand these subjective experiences, these mental chain reactions, we have to be willing to ask those bigger questions. What is consciousness? How does the mind interact with the world? And those are questions that science can't answer on its own,
No, need both.
Absolutely.
It's interesting because it really does make his work seem shockingly relevant, even now, Like Araújo talks about this concept Wundt had for Schmelzung, which is German for.
Yeah. Fusion, basically. And it gets at this idea that our complex mental states, those rich internal experiences we're always having, they don't just come out of nowhere. They're not just the result of whatever's happening externally. They emerge from this fusion of simpler things, individual sensations, memories, emotions, thoughts. It's like all these internal bits and pieces are coming together, fusing, and then boom, you've got something new and complex. And it's that process, that fusion, that's what gives our experiences this richness, this depth, that totally unique personal quality.
So it's not enough to just identify the individual thoughts, the individual sensations. It's about understanding how they all come together to create our sense of self, our understanding of the world, how we experience reality from one moment to the next. It's like our consciousness is constantly weaving together these intricate tapestries of experience, pulling from all these different internal threads.
And that's an idea that gets lost sometimes, even in psychology. We break things down, we analyze, we want to find the individual components of thought and behavior. But Wundt was saying, hey, the whole is actually greater than the sum of its parts. It's that fusion, that coming together of inner experience. That's where things get really interesting. That's where we see the true complexity of the mind.
It's like that saying, we don't see the world as it is, we see it as we are. In Wundt's work, it reminds us that who we are, it's this constantly changing fusion of experiences, shaped by those internal mental chains he was so fascinated by.
It's true. And that's something I think is worth thinking about for all of us, really. I mean, we've learned so much about the brain. We're mapping it out in incredible detail. But what if we brought back some of Wundt's ideas, his focus on experience, on these subjective mental states?
Yeah.
Could that unlock new levels of understanding, new ways of approaching the mind? Could it help us bridge that gap between the physical brain we can see and the feeling, experiencing self that we all are?
It's definitely a question worth exploring. It's like Wundt's whispering to us from the past, saying, hey, don't forget about the mystery. Don't get so caught up in the physical that you forget to explore those hidden depths of experience. That's where the real secrets of consciousness are hiding.
I love that.
And on that note, we'll leave everyone with a little philosophical something to ponder. This has been a fascinating deep dive, I have to say, full of surprises. Yeah. Thanks for joining me on this little journey back to the birth of psychology and the legacy of Wilhelm Wundt.
The pleasure was all mine. It's always exciting to revisit these ideas, these foundational thinkers. It's amazing how relevant they still are, how much they can teach us all these years later.